In my decades of analyzing the human psyche, sitting across from hundreds of tormented souls at my clinic in Zurich, I observed a deeply unsettling pattern that most of society completely misinterprets. There is a specific form of human behavior that provokes an immediate, almost instinctive hostility in others, yet it involves no words, no aggression, and no overt conflict. It is the simple, intentional presence of silence. When a person steps back from the frantic noise of social validation, when they choose not to offer immediate emotional reactions, nervous laughter, or empty agreeable chatter, something extraordinary and terrifying occurs in the room. The atmosphere shifts, smiles freeze, uncomfortable shifts in posture begin. Society instinctively labels a quiet individual as arrogant, distant, broken, or cold. But during my years of clinical research, I realized a disturbing truth. What modern psychology calls a social defect or awkwardness, I recognized as a highly potent psychological mirror. Your silence does not make people uncomfortable because it is empty. It makes them uncomfortable because it is intensely, mercilessly full. When you offer complete silence in a room filled with social pretense, you cease to act as a participant in their theater and instead become an unyielding screen upon which they are forced to project their own unintegrated shadow. Most human conversation is not an exchange of genuine truth. It is a delicate, unspoken agreement to uphold one another's artificial personas. People speak continuously not to communicate but to soothe their own underlying existential anxiety, to verify that their social mask is intact, and to ensure that no one inspects the quiet voids within them. When you hold your peace, you break this invisible contract. You refuse to provide the constant validation that their fragile egos require to maintain their illusions. The quiet space you create acts as a vacuum, and the human mind cannot tolerate a psychological vacuum. It will instantly fill that void with its deepest insecurities, its repressed guilt, and its unacknowledged fears. Understanding this mechanism is not merely an exercise in curiosity. It will reveal the hidden psychological motives of everyone around you and force you to confront the quiet depths of your own unintegrated shadow. Let me share a specific clinical case from my practice in Zurich that permanently altered how I viewed the power of quiet observation. A young man named Richard came to my consulting room, deeply distressed because his colleagues and family members repeatedly accused him of being deceitful, manipulative, and hostile, despite his soft-spoken and gentle nature. Richard was a man of few words, possessed of a naturally calm and reflective disposition. He did not engage in office gossip, he rarely interrupted others, and when asked a question, he would pause thoughtfully before delivering a direct, measured answer. Yet his mere presence in the office seemed to provoke intense anxiety among his peers. His supervisor grew increasingly paranoid, constantly accusing Richard of plotting against him or harboring hidden disdain for the company. When I analyzed Richard in my clinic, I looked beyond his surface symptoms and examined the micro-expressions and subtle energy exchanges occurring around him. I paid close attention to how his silence operated during our sessions. When Richard sat in absolute quiet, his eyes steady and his posture still, I noticed a subtle impulse rising within my own psyche, a momentary urge to fill the space, to explain myself, to justify my thoughts. For an untrained mind, that rising instinct feels like a threat originating from the quiet person. But as a psychiatrist, I knew precisely what was occurring. Richard was not doing anything to these people. His stillness was simply exposing the chaos that already existed within their own repressed minds. His supervisor was harboring immense feelings of inadequacy and secret professional deceit. When confronted with Richard's unreadable neutral calm, the supervisor's ego assumed Richard knew his secrets. The silence acted as an unblemished mirror, reflecting the supervisor's hidden guilt directly back at him. Pay close attention to how micro-expressions manifest when you stop offering verbal fillers. Notice how people begin to touch their neck, adjust their clothes, or break eye contact when you do not immediately validate their statements with a nervous chuckle or an agreeing nod. Their unconscious mind recognizes that their persona has lost control of the narrative. If you have ever felt the weight of being alienated simply because you chose to listen rather than participate in empty noise, take a moment right now and write in the comments below. I claim my inner quiet. Let this serve as a conscious recognition of your own depth. When a person who relies heavily on their social persona encounters genuine silence, the psychological breakdown occurs in distinct, predictable phases. In the beginning, they will attempt to lure you back into the collective script using social pressure. They will ask if you are upset, if something is wrong, or why you are being so quiet. What they are truly asking, beneath the surface of their polite concern, is, "Please resume validating my mask so I do not have to feel my own internal void." If you remain centered and do not yield to this pressure, a fascinating shift occurs. I call this the breakdown of the persona, a moment where the pressure of the quiet void forces their repressed material to break through to the surface. Under the weight of sustained silence, individuals who have not integrated their shadow will almost always reveal their true nature. The weak will become obsequious and overly apologetic, attempting to buy your approval with exaggerated affection. The insecure and aggressive will become hostile, accusing you of judgment, superiority, or malice. Notice the profound asymmetry here. You have said nothing, yet they have exposed their entire internal architecture. An unconscious person cannot tolerate neutrality. To an unexamined ego, neutrality is interpreted as a direct attack because the ego survives purely on feedback, emotional reactions, and social reinforcement. An integrated, self-aware individual, however, responds to silence in a strikingly different manner. A person who has confronted their own shadow does not fear quiet space. They welcome it. They do not feel compelled to fill the air with trivialities, nor do they project their hidden guilt onto your stillness. They can sit beside you in profound silence without discomfort, recognizing that true human connection exists far beyond the superficial realm of constant chatter. This distinction is vital for your own psychological safety. It allows you to develop what I term conscious boundaries and selective empathy. You begin to understand that you are not obligated to manage the psychological discomfort of those who live in constant flight from themselves. When someone becomes unnerved by your quiet presence, they are giving you a precise diagnosis of their own internal disharmony. If you recognize the power of staying centered while others lose their footing in the noise, write in the comments below. My peace is non-negotiable. Validate your commitment to maintaining a differentiated consciousness amidst the collective uproar. To fully grasp why silence exerts such an immense power over the human mind, we must explore the deep architecture of the psyche, as I have mapped it throughout my life's work. The human mind is divided into distinct layers. The conscious ego, the personal unconscious, and the vast, ancient collective unconscious. Within the personal unconscious lies the shadow, the repository of all our rejected traits, forbidden desires, weakness, and unacknowledged truths. To protect the ego from the terrifying contents of the shadow, the mind constructs the persona, a polished social mask designed to seek approval and maintain the illusion of control. When two people engage in typical conversation, it is usually not two genuine human beings speaking. It is two personas performing a carefully choreographed dance. The words spoken serve as a shield, preventing either party from looking too closely at what lies beneath the mask. But when you deploy deliberate, conscious silence, you step off the stage and stop performing. By withdrawing your participation in the dance, you strip the other person's persona of its function. Without an audience to accept the mask, the persona falters, and the barrier between their conscious ego and their dark personal shadow begins to crumble. The unintegrated contents of their shadow suddenly threaten to spill over into consciousness. Throughout my clinical work, I categorized how different personalities react when confronted by this psychological vacuum. I have structured these reactions into 3 distinct shadow traps that people fall into when exposed to profound silence. The first category is the projection trap. In this state, the individual's ego cannot process the neutrality of silence, so it projects its own hidden hostility or fear onto the silent observer. If they secretly harbor feelings of worthlessness, they will instantly convince themselves that your silence means you are judging them, looking down on them, or plotting against them. They attribute their own dark, unacknowledged self-criticism to your mind, transforming you into an imagined enemy to avoid facing their own internal self-hatred. The second category is the agitated compensator. This is an individual whose entire psychological stability relies on external validation and continuous social momentum. When met with silence, their anxiety spikes dramatically. They begin to speak faster, over-explain simple concepts, reveal private information they later regret sharing, or attempt to force laughter. Their conscious mind is desperately trying to construct a wall of sound to keep their own rising existential dread at bay. The third category is the hostile disruptor. This represents a person whose shadow is heavily dominated by a desire for control and dominance. To them, silence is a direct threat to their authority because silence cannot be easily manipulated or directed. Because they cannot control your quiet mind, they feel a profound loss of power. Consequently, they will attempt to provoke you using sarcastic remarks, subtle insults, or public confrontation to force you into an emotional reaction. The moment you react emotionally, they regain control, using your reaction to stabilize their fragile ego. Understanding these 3 shadow traps provides you with an invaluable tool for psychological archaeology. You begin to realize that when people react negatively to your stillness, they are demonstrating their own developmental stage within the process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward integrating the conscious and unconscious mind. Now, we must transition from clinical theory to practical life. How do you apply this understanding without becoming isolated or cold? How do you use the power of silence as a tool for self-realization and proper boundary setting rather than a weapon of passive aggression? You must subject yourself to what I call the integration test. First, let us examine how silence operates within romantic relationships. In intimate partnerships, constant verbal exchange can sometimes mask a lack of true psychological intimacy. Couples often talk continuously to avoid confronting the growing emotional distance between them. To test the depth of a bond, observe what occurs when words cease. Can you sit in the same room with your partner in complete, comfortable quiet for extended periods without either person feeling anxiety, resentment, or the need to create artificial distraction? True psychological union allows 2 people to share a quiet space where their unconscious minds rest in mutual safety. If silence in your relationship immediately breeds tension, suspicion, or panic, it reveals that the connection is built primarily on the mutual validation of masks rather than a genuine meeting of souls. Second, observe the dynamics within the workplace and broader social systems. In corporate or hierarchical environments, noise is frequently used as a display of dominance. Unconscious individuals talk over one another, repeat points loudly, and use verbal dominance to claim territory. When you introduce measured, intentional silence into these environments, you instantly alter the power dynamic. When someone presents an aggressive demand, an unreasonable critique, or a manipulative comment, do not rush to defend yourself. Pause. Offer a calm, steady gaze and remain entirely quiet for 3 to 5 seconds before responding. In those few seconds of silence, the manipulative individual is forced to sit with the weight of their own words. More often than not, they will begin to backtrack, soften their stance, or offer concessions, simply to relieve the immense psychological pressure created by your stillness. Strategic silence in social systems is not passivity. It is an immovable anchor of authority. Third, you must practice silence within your private self-reflection, the sacred realm of inner work. It is easy to use silence as a lens to diagnose others, but its most profound purpose is to illuminate your own internal landscape. When you sit alone in an empty room with no devices, no books, no music, and no external stimulation, what rises to the surface of your mind? Do you feel a serene calm? Or do you experience an immediate itching urge to distract yourself? The discomfort you feel in your own absolute silence is the precise measure of how much unintegrated shadow material remains buried within you. As I have written throughout my career, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. However, I must issue a stern warning. Do not allow this knowledge to corrupt your ego. It is immensely tempting to take these insights and turn yourself into a shadow hunter, someone who arrogantly uses deliberate silence to weaponize psychological discomfort, to look down upon others, or to manipulate social dynamics for personal amusement. If you use silence as a cold mask to induce anxiety in others, you have not achieved integrated consciousness. You have merely adopted a new, far more insidious persona. You are playing a dangerous game with the psyche, using psychological detachment to hide your own fear of authentic vulnerability. Always remember the fundamental mirror effect. Everything that unnerves you about another person's reaction to your silence is ultimately a reflection of the human condition that exists within you as well. If someone's anxious reaction to your quietness fills you with smug superiority, you are revealing a massive, unintegrated blind spot in your own shadow, a latent drive for power and intellectual grandiosity that will eventually cause your own psychological downfall. True psychological strength is marked by deep compassion, not arrogant detachment. When your silence is rooted in genuine inner peace rather than cold judgment, it becomes a sanctuary, not a weapon. The journey toward individuation demands that you cultivate a mind capable of standing firm in its own quiet center, untamed by the collective noise of the world. Society will always demand that you conform to its endless chatter, that you perform for its approval, and that you sacrifice your depth to keep its fragile illusions alive. But the soul is not built in the noise. The soul is discovered, forged, and integrated in the profound, unshakable depths of inner quiet. When you master your silence, you cease to be a passive leaf blown about by every social wind. You become an enduring tree, deeply rooted in the soil of your own unconscious truth. Stand firm in your stillness. Allow the world to react, allow the masks to fall away, and trust the profound wisdom that resides within the quiet depths of your own psyche. Do not fear the silence that separates you from the shallow crowd, for it is in that precise space that your true, integrated self is born.